Aldrich had been dying for 6 months, slowly enough to still chop kindling, but fast enough that he'd already buried his wife and knew his two small children would be orphans before spring. So he went to the worst tavern in Lowtown and whispered a name. Greca, the orc assassin, arrived 3 nights later, a hulking green shadow with tusks filed to points and a reputation for finishing every contract without flinching. She found him kneeling by the hearth, ready to die. But before steel met flesh, a floorboard creaked. Two small faces peered from a pile of blankets in the corner. A boy clutching a carved wooden fox, a girl with her thumb in her mouth, still dreaming. The orc's arm went slack. "You have children," she said, and her voice, which had been a weapon a moment ago, cracked into something raw. The blade dropped onto the stones with a clang that woke the boy. Aldrich had been a carpenter before the wasting sickness took his lungs. After his wife died of the same blight, he'd sold every tool to buy his children one more month of food. When the coin ran out, dying in front of them felt like a slower, crueler violence than a blade. So he'd visited the worst tavern in Lowtown, where desperate men traded in final solutions, and whispered Greca's name into the dark. He expected a monster. He hired an ending. Instead, the assassin knelt, stared at his sleeping son and daughter, and saw her own ghosts. She pressed the knife hilt into his hand and offered a different bargain. A life for a life. The question that would reshape every assumption about mercy, vengeance, and the monsters we summon is simply this. What happens when the killer you paid to end your story becomes the only person willing to fight for its next chapter? To understand that, you have to understand what Aldrich was before the sickness hollowed him out. He was a carpenter in the Lowtown ward, the kind of craftsman whose joinery didn't need nails. He could look at a fallen oak and see a staircase. His wife, Maren, worked the loom at the River Guild. Together they had scraped enough to buy a small cottage with a slate roof that didn't leak, and for 5 years the walls held the sound of children laughing. Then the gray blight came. It started in the grain stores, a fine ash-colored mold that got into the lungs. By the end of the first winter, a third of Lowtown was coughing blood. Maren was gone before the snow melted. Aldrich buried her with a wooden marker he carved himself, a fox, her favorite, and 2 months later his own cough turned wet and deep. The physician said he had maybe a year, and every day of that year would be a negotiation with pain. He kept swinging the hatchet as long as he could, taking rough carpentry jobs that paid half what his skill was worth because the middlemen knew a dying man doesn't bargain. He sold his best tools first, then the cart, then the wedding silver. By the month before spring, the only things of value left in the house were the roof over his children's heads and the children themselves. The boy, Tam, was 5, a quiet child who had watched his mother disappear and now watched his father shrink. The girl, Scylla, was 3, still young enough to believe that the gaunt man coughing into a rag was just tired. Every night, Aldrich sat at the hearth after they fell asleep and ran the arithmetic. If he died tomorrow, the children would be wards of the parish orphanage, which was a slower, hungrier kind of death. If he sold the cottage, he could buy a few months of hired care, but the buyers knew the blight was in the walls. No one would touch the property. So the arithmetic led to a single, brutal solution. If he was going to die anyway, he could make his death worth something. There was a market for that. In Lowtown, men spoke in whispers about the Greca contract. Greca was not a legend. She was a fact, one of the few orcs who operated south of the pass, and the most expensive killer in the province. Her reputation was built on 3 things: absolute discretion, absolute lethality, and an unbreakable rule. She never refused a contract once it was sealed, and she never killed a child. That last part was widely discussed in the taverns. Half the stories said she'd once walked away from a king's ransom because a 5-year-old was in the wrong room. Aldrich didn't care about the stories. He cared that she was the only assassin who might be trusted to take the job without complaint and leave his children untouched. The plan was monstrous but simple. He would use his last copper to hire Greca to kill him in a way that looked like a robbery, and he would time it so that the killing happened after he'd signed over the cottage to a distant cousin in a paper deal that would at least keep Tam and Scylla out of the orphanage. The cousin, a woman named Elara, who lived in the northern hills, would take them in. Aldrich would be dead, but his children would have a roof and a guardian. It was the least terrible of all the terrible options. He made the payment on a moonless night at the Crooked Nail, a tavern where the floorboards were sticky with old ale and older secrets. He told the barkeep he needed to speak to a woman who solved problems. The barkeep didn't ask follow-ups. An hour later, a young human man with a scarred neck appeared, took Aldrich's coin pouch, and told him to wait at home 3 nights later. Aldrich nodded and walked back through the rain, coughing so hard he had to lean against the butcher's stall halfway home. He spent the next 3 days building a wooden fox for Tam and a spinning top for Scylla, finishing them by the fire while the children slept. He wrote a letter to Elara explaining nothing, just that the children would need a mother. He placed it under the floorboard beneath his bed. On the 3rd night, he sent the children to the neighbors with a lie about a broken oven. Then he knelt by the hearth, hands clasped, and waited. He heard her before he saw her. The door didn't creak, the air simply changed pressure, and then she was inside, a hulking green shadow that seemed to swallow the firelight. Greca's tusks were filed to sharp points, her arms corded with muscle, and she carried a curved blade that had ended lords and deserters alike. She looked at the kneeling man, at the empty room, and she didn't ask why he wanted to die. That wasn't her business. "You, Aldrich?" she rumbled. He nodded, eyes closed. What she didn't know, and what Aldrich had failed to prevent, was that his sister-in-law had refused to keep the children that night. "Too much work," she'd said, and sent them back home. Tam had led Scylla in through the back window, the one that never latched properly, because he was scared of the dark and wanted his own bed. He had piled blankets in the corner behind the wood chest, a little nest where he and Scylla often hid during storms. When Greca's blade was halfway to Aldrich's throat, Scylla mumbled something in her sleep, and the floorboard creaked under Tam's shifting weight. Greca froze. Her eyes, trained for ambush, flicked to the corner. Through the gap in the blankets, she saw a small hand clutching the carved fox Aldrich had finished an hour earlier. Then another face, a girl's, thumb in mouth, dreaming. The sight hit her like a physical blow. "You have children," she said, and the voice that had been a weapon became something raw and uneven. The blade dropped. It clanged on the hearthstones, loud enough to wake Tam. The boy scrambled up, wide-eyed, and Greca stared at him as if he were a ghost wearing her own dead son's face. Because in her former life, before the contracts and the killing, Greca had been a mother. She had lived in a mountain settlement with a partner and a young son, and one day a territorial raid had taken them both while she was hunting in the high ridges. She had come home to ashes. She had taken a father once, the man who ordered that raid, and after she killed him she had sworn an oath. No more children, no more orphans, no more endings that left a child alone in the dark. She'd been carrying that oath in silence for 12 years. Now she knelt, picked up the knife, and pressed the hilt into Aldrich's shaking hand. "You won't pay me with your death," she said. "You'll pay me by letting me stay, to hunt, to chop, to keep them fed until you're gone, and after. A life for a life." Aldrich, too stunned to weep, watched the assassin become a shield between his children and the world. That was the bargain. But bargains struck in the shadow of desperate hope demand a reckoning. And the first test arrived sooner than anyone expected. 4 days later, when a man named Halder Voss rode up to the cottage with 3 hired blades, a debt contract Aldrich had thought expired, and a smile that said he'd just found something worth more than coin inside that crumbling little house. The man's name was Halder Voss, and in the hierarchy of Lowtown predators, he was a mid-level collector for a lending house that specialized in despair. He'd bought Aldrich's old debt from a grain merchant who'd written it off as uncollectible, paying a fraction of the sum for the right to squeeze whatever remained. Voss had expected to find a dying carpenter with empty cupboards. Instead, when he rounded the bend in the cart path and saw smoke rising from the cottage chimney, he saw opportunity. The cottage itself was worth little, blighted, dilapidated, sinking into the mud. But the land it sat on was a different matter. The parcel abutted the Thornwood, which had recently been surveyed for a new Crown logging contract. And Voss knew that if he could produce a clear deed, the real money wasn't in the timber. It was in whoever wanted the timbers stopped. The Thornwood was contested ground, claimed by the provincial governor and the Orc clans of the Northern Pass alike, and a human holding in the buffer zone was a legal inconvenience that someone would pay generously to remove. He dismounted with a smile that had been practiced on 36 defaulted farmers. His 3 hired blades fanned out behind him. Former garrison soldiers, now working private contracts for a percentage of the take. The morning frost was still on the ground, and the children were inside with Aldrich, finishing a thin porridge that Grecka had stretched with foraged roots. She had been chopping wood in the side yard, the axe moving in a rhythm so steady it sounded like a heartbeat. When Voss called out Aldrich's name, she set the axe down, but she kept the splitting maul in her left hand. The weight of it was a comfort she didn't question. Aldrich came to the door, still in his sleeping shirt, the cough rattling his frame as he stepped into the cold. He recognized Voss immediately. The man had been a minor nuisance for months. Letters demanding payment, threats of seizure. But Aldrich had assumed his death would settle the account. The debt was 19 silver marks, a sum he'd borrowed to pay the physician who had told him he was dying. The irony was not lost on him. Halder, Aldrich said, and the name came out hoarse. I don't have the silver, you know that. Voss spread his hands in mock sympathy. I'm not here for silver, Aldrich. I'm here for the deed. He gestured at the cottage, the sagging roof, the blighted fields. The land's worth more than you've ever earned in your life. Sign it over, and the debt is cleared. I'll even throw in a cart ride to the parish house for you and your little ones. He smiled again, and the smile didn't reach his eyes. You'll be dead by summer anyway. What do you care who owns the dirt? Aldrich's hand tightened on the doorframe. He had been prepared to die to give his children a future. He had not been prepared to give them to a man like Voss. But before he could answer, a shadow moved behind him. Grecka stepped into the doorway. She had to duck slightly to clear the lintel, and when she straightened, her full height blocked the morning light. Voss's smile flickered, recalibrated, and returned. He had heard rumors that Aldrich had taken on a hired hand, some brute from the pass. But the rumors had not specified that the brute was a 7-foot orc woman with tusks sharpened to points and forearms thicker than his thigh. His hired blades shifted uneasily. Garrison soldiers knew enough to be afraid of orcs. Orc warriors, especially female ones, were legendary for their ferocity in close quarters. But Voss was a man who dealt in leverage, not violence, and he saw the children's faces peeking from the window. He saw the way Aldrich positioned himself between the door and the yard. He did the arithmetic. You must be the new help, Voss said, his tone deliberately light. I don't know what he's paying you, but I can offer better. The province is clearing out squatters from the buffer zone. This cottage is an illegal holding, always has been, even before your friend here inherited it. The governor's office will have it by midsummer regardless. I'm offering a peaceful exit. He turned his attention back to Aldrich. Sign the deed. Walk away. Or I come back with a magistrate's writ and a full contingent. Your choice. Greca didn't speak. She was looking at the three hired men, reading their postures the way she had once read enemy formations on the battlefield. The one on the left was nervous, his hand resting on his sword hilt, but not gripping it. The one in the center was the leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his chin who had the calm of someone who'd seen real combat. The third was young, maybe 19, shifting his weight from foot to foot, untested, eager to prove himself. Greca filed these observations away. She had been an assassin for 12 years, but before that, she had been a war leader of the Broken Ridge clan. She had commanded 50 warriors in border skirmishes against human incursions. She knew the difference between a threat and a bluff, and Halder Voss was a man who had never been hit hard enough to understand the cost of his own words. Aldrich tried to answer, but a coughing fit doubled him over. He stumbled back into the cottage, and Greca used the motion as cover. She stepped outside and closed the door behind her. The three hired men tensed. The leader's hand moved to his sword. The young one's eyes went wide. Greca didn't draw a weapon. She simply looked at Voss and said, "The debt is 19 silver marks." It was not a question. Voss's smile tightened. He had not expected her to know the number. "That's correct. You paid less than 5 to acquire it. You will accept 5 in return. You will consider the matter closed." She reached into a pouch at her belt and produced 5 silver coins, the whole of what Aldrich had paid her for his own death. She tossed them onto the frozen ground at Voss's feet. The coins landed with a soft clink, and no one moved. The insult was precise. An orc paying a human's debt in coin she'd earned from the man himself, throwing it into the mud. It was the kind of symbolic violence that orc elders used to end negotiations before they began. Voss's face flushed. He had been insulted in front of his men, and a man like Halder Voss could not afford to be seen accepting a 5 silver settlement from an orc squatter. His reputation in Lowtown depended on his ability to squeeze blood from stone. If word got out that he'd backed down, his other debtors would stop paying. He nodded to the broad-shouldered man. "Take the deed. Kill the orc if she interferes." The leader drew his sword. It was a standard garrison blade, single-edged, slightly notched from service. He had been a sergeant once, before a gambling debt had forced him into private work, and he still moved with the economy of a soldier who'd been trained to fight in formation. He stepped forward, blade raised, and Greca let him come. She had no sword of her own, only the splitting maul, which she now lifted casually, as if it weighed nothing. The sergeant lunged. Greca pivoted, and the blade passed through empty air. Her counter was not a swing, but a thrust with the butt of the maul, driving into the sergeant's sternum with enough force to crack bone. He dropped to his knees, gasping, his sword clattering onto the frozen ground. The young one, panicking, charged with a dagger. Greca caught his wrist, twisted, and the dagger fell. She didn't break the wrist. She held it, immobilized, and looked into the boy's eyes. "Go home," she said, and released him. He stumbled backward, turned, and ran. The third man had already decided he was not being paid enough. He dropped his weapon and backed away, hands raised. Voss was alone. He pulled a small crossbow from beneath his coat, a holdout weapon, illegal for a civilian to carry, and leveled it at Greca. "You think you've won?" he said, his voice pitched high with fear. The governor's office already knows about this parcel. The magistrate will be here by week's end. You can't fight the crown." Greca took a step toward him, and the crossbow bolt fired. It was a desperate shot, poorly aimed. She tilted her head, and the bolt whistled past her ear, embedding itself in the cottage door. Before Voss could reload, the maul was in her hands, swinging in a flat arc. She didn't hit him with the head of it. She had no need to kill. She struck the crossbow with the haft, shattering the stock into splinters. Voss screamed and dropped the remnants, nursing a broken finger. He looked at his fallen men, at the shattered crossbow, at the green-skinned woman who had just dismantled his entire operation in under 90 seconds. "You've made a mistake," he said, backing toward his horse. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Greca said. "A man who buys debts he can't collect. A man who brings 3 soldiers to threaten a dying carpenter. A man who fires a crossbow at an unarmed woman and misses." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a rumble that vibrated in the cold air. "I have killed lords, Halder Voss. I have killed generals. I have killed men who thought they were safe behind walls and armies and alliances. You are none of those things. You are a nuisance, and if you come back here, if you send anyone else, I will treat you as what you are, not what you pretend to be." Voss mounted his horse, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. The sergeant managed to stagger to his feet, clutching his chest. They retreated down the cart path, leaving the 3 hired blades, one unconscious, one fleeing, one cowed, to fend for themselves. Greca watched them go until they were out of sight. Then she turned, pulled the crossbow bolt from the door, and went inside. Aldrich was sitting on the floor, his back against the hearth, Tam and Scylla huddled against him. He had seen enough through the window to understand what had happened. "They'll come back," he said, his voice a whisper. "Voss is connected. He'll petition the magistrate. He'll find a way to make us leave." Greca knelt and placed the bolt on the hearthstone. "Voss is not the problem," she said. "He was a tool. Someone wanted him to clear this land. The logging contract is a cover. No one cares about the timber. This parcel sits on the Thornwood border. It's the only human-held property in the buffer zone that has a clear deed. If the governor's office can acquire it, they can legally station troops there. That gives them a forward position against the orc clans. If the clans hold it, they can block human expansion. Either way, this cottage is a strategic asset. She had spent her early years as a war leader, and she still thought in terms of terrain and control. Aldrich's cottage was not a home. It was a contested position on an unmarked border. "The blight," Aldrich said suddenly, his eyes widening. "The Grey Blight. It didn't start in the grain stores. It started here. On this land." The physician said the mold was unusual. He'd never seen it so concentrated. Marin died first because she worked the garden. She breathed it in every day. He looked at Greca, and the realization turned his voice cold. "Someone poisoned the soil, to drive us out, to make the land unlivable so the deed would be abandoned." Greca's jaw tightened. Biological warfare was a tactic the human armies had used against the orc clans for decades, spreading rust blight on crops and poison oak on grazing land. If someone had targeted Aldrich's family specifically, it meant the land was more valuable than she had initially calculated. The crown wanted it. The clans wanted it. And now, a dying carpenter with a forged deed and 2 children stood at the center of a conflict that could ignite a border war. She stood and walked to the window. On the distant ridge, beyond the Thornwood, she saw a flicker of movement. A scout, crouched low, moving through the underbrush. Not human, the silhouette was too broad, the stride too efficient. An orc scout, from one of the clans watching the cottage. She had been seen. If the clans knew an orc woman was defending a human holding, they would consider her a traitor. If the crown knew an orc assassin was squatting on a strategic parcel, they would send more than a magistrate's writ. Two forces, converging, with Aldric's children caught in the crossfire. Greca turned back to Aldric. "We have 2 days," she said. "Maybe less. Before sundown, I need to train you." Aldric stared at her, his hollow chest heaving. "Train me? I can barely stand." "You don't need to stand," Greca said, and for the first time since the blade had dropped 4 nights ago, there was something other than exhaustion in her eyes. It was the cold, patient focus of a strategist who had survived multiple wars by fighting the ones she couldn't avoid. "You need to hold a crossbow. You need to know where to hide your children. And you need to understand what you're willing to do when they come for her." She nodded at Scylla, who was still clutching the wooden fox, her small face pale with a fear she was too young to name. Aldric looked at his daughter, then at the orc assassin who had become his last ally, and for the first time since the blight took his wife, he felt something other than resignation. It was a slow, burning fury. He was still dying. But he was no longer waiting. The training began that afternoon. Greca dragged the chopping block into the center of the cottage and set the crossbow, the one she'd taken from Halder Voss's shattered weapon and hastily repaired with leather strapping, on the table. Aldric looked at it like it was a snake. His hands, once strong enough to shape oak beams without nails, now trembled from fatigue. But Greca didn't make allowances for dying men. She made allowances for fathers. She positioned a chair behind the overturned hearth table and showed him how to brace the crossbow against the stone edge, how to aim low because the recoil would kick upward, how to fire from a kneeling position that didn't require standing. She drilled him for 2 hours until his fingers blistered and his cough turned wetter, and she didn't stop until he could load, aim, and fire in under 30 seconds. Then, she turned her attention to Tam. The boy was 5, but Greca didn't see age. She saw a small person who needed to survive an event that adults would fail to prevent. She knelt so that she was at his eye level, her tusks inches from his face, and he didn't flinch. He had already decided 3 nights ago that the green-skinned woman who dropped her knife instead of using it was not a threat. "Tam," she said, "if you hear me say the word badger, you take your sister and you go to the crawl space beneath the floor behind the wood chest. You don't come out until you hear me say sunrise. Do you understand?" Tam nodded solemnly. She made him repeat the words 3 times, then showed him the loose floorboard herself. Scylla watched with her thumb in her mouth, clutching the fox. She was too young to understand, but she would follow her brother. Greca knew that the reliability of a 5-year-old under fire was a fragile foundation for a defense plan. But it was the only foundation they had. Night fell. Greca didn't sleep. She sat by the window, the splitting maul propped beside her, watching the ridge. The orc scout she'd glimpsed earlier had not reappeared, but that absence was its own kind of signal. A clan scout that watches a position and then withdraws is not abandoning the position. It's reporting back. Somewhere in the Thornwood, a war leader was receiving intelligence about an orc female defending a human cottage on contested ground, and that intelligence would force a decision. Either the clan would investigate directly, or they would assume she was a renegade and act accordingly. Neither was good. An hour before dawn, a new sound joined the wind. Hoofbeats, multiple, moving at a disciplined trot from the direction of the lowlands. Greca woke Aldric with a hand on his shoulder. He gasped awake, coughing, and she held a finger to her lips. "They're earlier than I expected," she said. "The magistrate." Get the children into the crawl space. Now, Aldrich didn't ask questions. He lifted Tam and Scylla from the blankets, whispered to them, and guided them to the hidden compartment beneath the floor. Tam carried the wooden fox. Scylla didn't cry. That alone told Aldrich how much the world had already changed for his daughter. Grekka stepped outside. The first gray light of morning revealed a column of riders, 6 crowned soldiers in light armor, a clerk carrying a scroll case, and at the head a magistrate in formal robes, his horse caparisoned with the governor's crest. Beside the magistrate rode a familiar figure, Halder Voss, his broken finger splinted, his face still bruised from the humiliation of the day before. He had ridden overnight to fetch them. Grekka noted the composition. 6 soldiers, not a full platoon. The magistrate had come expecting to enforce a writ against a squatter, not to confront an armed orc veteran. That miscalculation might be the only advantage she had. The magistrate reined up and surveyed the cottage with the practiced disdain of a man who had evicted 100 families and slept soundly after each. By order of the governor of the northern province, he called. Reading from the scroll the clerk handed him, the property commonly known as the Aldrich Cottage, situated on parcel 774 of the Thornwood Buffer Zone, is declared an unlawful holding. The occupant, Aldrich of Lowtown, is hereby ordered to vacate immediately. All structures will be demolished to restore the land to Crown jurisdiction. Resistance will be met with force. He rolled the scroll and looked at Grekka as if noticing her for the first time. You must be the hired hand. I've heard about you. Assault on a duly appointed debt collector, destruction of property, reckless endangerment. I can add charges if you prefer, but I'd rather not. Step aside. Grekka didn't move. The occupant is dying, she said. He has 2 children inside. The blight that killed his wife is in the soil. If you demolish this cottage, you'll release the spores again. Your soldiers will breathe it. So will you. The magistrate's expression flickered. He hadn't known about the blight. He was a legal functionary, not a scientist. But behind him, Voss leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. She's lying. The blight was an accident. A crop disease, nothing more. Grekka caught the lie before Voss himself knew he'd told it. He had just confirmed that the blight was not a crop disease. He had just told her that he knew it was something else. Her eyes narrowed. Voss hadn't used the word accident because he believed it. He used it because he was covering for the person who had ordered it. The magistrate hesitated. If there's a health risk, I can request a quarantine assessment. That would delay enforcement by perhaps a week. Voss's face reddened. A week is too long. The logging contract is time-sensitive. The governor wants this settled. The magistrate gave Voss a look that suggested he didn't appreciate being pressured by a debt collector. But before the argument could continue, a new sound cut through the morning. A horn, low and resonant, blowing from the tree line. It was not a human horn. It was the deep, vibrating note of an orc war horn, the kind that carried for miles and signaled the approach of a full hunting party. Every head turned. Emerging from the thornwood came a dozen orc warriors, mounted on dire wolves bred for combat in the high passes. Their armor was bone and leather, their weapons a mix of axes and curved blades. At their head rode an older female, her hair silver-streaked, her face scarred by decades of border conflicts. She wore a torque of iron and gold around her neck, the mark of a clan war chief. Grekka recognized her instantly. The woman was Drogetha of the Broken Ridge clan, the same clan Grekka had once served. The same clan she had left 12 years earlier after her family was killed. The 2 women locked eyes across 200 yards of frost-covered ground, and the weight of a shared history that neither had ever resolved hung in the air like the promise of a storm. Drogatha raised a hand, and her riders halted. She spoke a command in the guttural tones of Orcish, and two of her warriors broke off, circling wide around the crowned soldiers. The magistrate soldiers drew their swords, but they were outnumbered 2-1, and dire wolves made their horses stamp and snort. The magistrate himself looked like a man who had just realized his legal authority didn't extend to the sharp end of a fight. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, but his voice had lost its certainty. Drogatha ignored him. She directed her mount toward the cottage, and when she was close enough to speak without raising her voice, she addressed Grekka directly. "I thought I recognized the description from the scouts, an orc female defending a human den. I said to myself, it can't be Grekka. Grekka died 12 years ago. But here you stand, with a splintered crossbow and a splitting maul, wearing the expression of a woman preparing to die for a dead man's children." Her tone was not hostile. It was measured, the tone of a leader appraising a lost asset. "Does the Broken Ridge mean so little to you now that you'd bleed for strangers?" Grekka's hand tightened on the maul. "The Broken Ridge bled for me first," she said. "Or did you forget who led the warriors away the day the raiders burned my home? Who left my family unguarded while you pursued a revenge campaign that gained nothing?" Drogatha's jaw clenched. The history was complicated. Grekka had been a war leader under Drogatha's command. When a human raid had struck their settlement, Drogatha had been leading a retaliatory strike of her own, leaving the village vulnerable. Grekka had returned to find her partner and son dead. She had blamed Drogatha, and the blame had shattered their bond. Grekka had left the clan, become an assassin, and never looked back. Drogatha, for her part, had spent a decade trying to forget the woman whose grief had accused her silently every time they met. "I made a mistake," Drogatha said, and the admission, delivered in front of her own warriors, was not a small thing. "I can't bring them back. But I can offer you a way out of this. The Broken Ridge has a claim on this land as well, older than the Crown's. We've been waiting for the right moment to assert it. If you stand with us now, if you help us secure this parcel, you can return to the clan. Full pardon. Your exile lifted. A place among us again." The offer was everything Grekka had never allowed herself to want. A way back. A home. The end of 12 years of wandering. But she looked at the magistrate and his soldiers, at the blighted soil, at the cottage where two children huddled beneath the floorboards. If she accepted Drogatha's offer, the crown would eventually retreat. But the conflict would not end. The crown would contest the claim for years, and in the meantime, Aldric would die, and his children would be caught in a war zone. The Broken Ridge couldn't protect a human family indefinitely. The clan's priority was the land, not the orphans. Grekka had been an orphan, in a sense, since her family's death. She knew what happened to children who were tolerated, but not loved. They survived, but they didn't heal. Before she could answer, Voss made a desperate move. He had been watching the exchange, and he saw the balance tipping away from the crown. If the Orc clan formally asserted a claim, the governor might pull back to avoid a border war, and Voss's chance at the land deed would evaporate. He drew a small dagger from his belt. The man had an endless supply of hidden weapons, and spurred his horse toward the cottage door. "The deed's in the house," he shouted. "Get it, and the land is still ours." He intended to break in, find the papers, and present the crown with a fait accompli. Grekka spun, but she was too far. The magistrate's soldiers, confused, didn't move. Drogatha's warriors tensed, but they were positioned to fight humans, not to intercept a single man. Voss reached the door, kicked it open, and vanished inside. Then, a sound that no one expected cut through the yard. A crossbow bolt, fired from inside the cottage, its twang sharp and final. Voss staggered back out, clutching his shoulder, the dagger falling from his hand. He collapsed onto the frozen ground, gasping. In the doorway stood Aldrich, the repaired crossbow in his trembling hands, his face gray with exhaustion, but his eyes steady. He had fired from the braced position Greca had drilled into him, and the bolt had hit its mark. He lowered the crossbow, looked at the man bleeding on his doorstep, and said, "The deed stays with my children." The calculus of the standoff shifted. The magistrate, seeing one of his party wounded, was now legally obligated to escalate. Drogatha, seeing a human shoot another human on contested ground, realized the situation was about to become a three-way fight. And Greca, standing at the pivot point of both conflicts, knew that the only way to prevent a massacre was to offer a solution that none of the three parties currently considered possible. She stepped between the magistrate and the warriors, placed her maul on the ground, and raised her empty hands. "I have a proposal," she said. "This land is blighted. You can't put soldiers here, they'd sicken. You can't build a logging operation, the trees are already gray with mold. The only value this parcel has is strategic, and that value depends on its neutrality. So I propose a trust. Aldrich's children inherit the deed. Until they reach adulthood, the cottage remains neutral ground, held by an independent warden. I will swear fealty to neither crown nor clan. I will guard the boundary, prevent incursion from either side, and ensure that this parcel doesn't become a flashpoint. In return, the crown drops its demolition order, and the Broken Ridge withdraws its claim. If either party breaks the trust, I will burn the deed, and the land reverts to unclaimed wilderness that neither of you can hold." It was audacious. An orc assassin, offering to become an independent power unto herself, with nothing but a blighted cottage and 2 orphans as her domain. The magistrate sputtered about legal precedent. Drogatha's eyes narrowed, calculating the political cost, but Greca's logic was unassailable. The blight made the land useless for occupation. The strategic value was in denying it to the other side. A neutral warden, bound by oath, would achieve that denial without bloodshed. And Greca's reputation, the orc who had killed lords, the woman who had refused a contract on a dying man with children, carried enough weight that her oath was not easily dismissed. Drogatha spoke first. "If I agree to this, you will never return to the Broken Ridge. You will be clanless forever. A ghost on the border." "I've been a ghost for 12 years, Greca said. "At least now I'll be a ghost with a purpose." Drogatha was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded, a single curt dip of her chin. "The Broken Ridge will honor the trust, but if you ever need warriors, Greca, you know where to find us." She turned her mount and signaled her riders to withdraw. The orc war horn sounded once more, this time retreating, and the hunting party melted back into the thornwood. The magistrate, left with a wounded debt collector, a reinstated deed, and an armed orc he couldn't arrest without starting a war, decided to cut his losses. He wrote a provisional order recognizing the trust, pending governor's approval, and had the clerk stamp it on the spot. The soldiers carried Voss away on a makeshift litter. The column retreated down the cart path, and by mid-morning the cottage was alone again, smoke rising from its chimney, the frozen ground churned by hooves and wolf paws, but no longer contested. Aldrich collapsed onto the hearth chair, the crossbow clattering beside him. The effort of firing the shot had cost him the last of his reserves, and his cough had worsened. But when Tam and Scylla emerged from the crawl space, blinking in the daylight, he smiled for the first time in months. A fragile, crooked smile, but a smile. Greca looked at the three of them, the dying carpenter, the quiet boy, the tiny girl with her wooden fox, and she felt something she hadn't felt since before her family died. The beginning of a new allegiance. She didn't know how long Aldrich had. The physician had said a year, and 5 months of that had already passed. But she knew that the trust she had proposed was not just a political convenience, it was a promise. And the most dangerous part of that promise wasn't the politics. It was the moment, 5 weeks later, when Aldrich's cough finally stilled, and she found herself standing in the cottage alone with 2 children, who looked at her with the expectation that she, the orc who had dropped her blade, would not leave them too. That moment was the pivot. Because the warden of the Thornwood border had not counted on becoming a mother again, and the world, which had been waiting for the buffer zone to collapse, was about to discover that the ghost guarding the gate was far more formidable than the assassin they remembered. Aldrich died on a morning in late spring, 6 months after the standoff that reshaped the Thornwood border. He went quietly, in the chair by the hearth, with the morning sun on his face and his children's wooden carvings arranged on the mantel above him. Tam was 6 by then, old enough to understand that his father wasn't sleeping. Scylla was 4. She stood in the doorway with the fox clutched to her chest and asked if Papa would wake up for breakfast. Greca knelt beside the chair for a long time, not weeping. She had wept her tears 12 years earlier, and the well had run dry, but sitting in the silence that a warrior gives to a fallen comrade. Then she rose, built a pyre in the side yard, and burned the body according to the orc custom of sending spirits to the high ridges. She did not send word to the parish. She did not register the death with the crown. The trust document she had brokered gave her legal wardship of the children, and she intended to exercise that right without inviting review. That night, after the children were asleep, Greca sat at the rough-hewn table and opened Aldrich's strongbox. Inside, beneath the deed and the trust papers, she found a letter addressed to her. He had written it in the weeks when his strength was fading, a carpenter's script in charcoal on scrap parchment. It read, "You told me once that you'd taken a father and sworn never to do it again. I don't know what oath you broke to spare me, but you gave my children a chance I couldn't give them. That debt is not mine to repay. It's theirs. Teach Tam to carve. Teach Scylla to read. Teach both of them that the world has monsters, but not all monsters are what they seem. And when you look at them, try to see not what you lost, but what you saved." That's how I got through the last months. I looked at them and saw everything Marin and I built together. Now you're the builder. Don't let the walls fall. Greca folded the letter and placed it inside her leather vest, next to the small carved wolf that had once belonged to her own son. She did not cry then either, but she did, for the first time in 12 years, allow herself to hope. The first year was brutal. The blight was still in the soil, and Greca quickly discovered that Aldrich's theory, that someone had poisoned the land deliberately, was correct. She found the source, a cache of rust spore canisters buried beneath the garden plot, manufactured with a military-grade seal that traced back to a supply depot under the Crown's quartermaster. The blight had not been a natural disease. It had been an act of economic warfare, timed to coincide with the logging contract, designed to sicken the occupants and render the parcel uninhabitable so the Crown could seize it without resistance. The person who had ordered it had covered their tracks well, but Greca was patient. She spent the winter months combing through traders' records, interrogating the few remaining Lowtown merchants who remembered the grain shipments from 3 years earlier. And in the mud of early spring she found the name, Magistrate Halloran. The same official who had ridden to evict them had been the one who authorized the deployment of the rust spore canisters on behalf of a consortium of timber speculators. He was dead now, killed in a riding accident 6 months before Aldrich, but his network remained. Grekka filed the information away. She did not seek revenge. Revenge was the old path, the path that had left her alone and clanless. Instead, she used the information as leverage. She sent a cryptic message to the governor's office, hinting that the full story of the Blight could become public if the trust were ever challenged. The governor, facing an election, quietly affirmed the trust's permanence and added a stipend for the children's education. The crown would never admit culpability, but it would also never move against the cottage again. With the political threat neutralized, Grekka turned to the land itself. The Blight had salted the soil, but Orc agricultural knowledge ran deep. Grekka knew of a hardy root vegetable, the creche tuber, that grew in blighted earth and absorbed fungal toxins into its leaves while purifying the ground around it. She traded with a passing clan caravan for seeds, and by the second summer, a half-acre of creche was thriving behind the cottage. The crop wasn't edible, the leaves accumulated the blight spores and had to be burned, but it cleansed the soil. Within 3 years, the garden was producing hardy greens again, and the gray mold had receded from the cottage walls. Tam, now 9, helped her plant and harvest. He was a quiet boy, still carrying the weight of his parents' deaths, but he poured his attention into woodcarving the way his father had. Grekka, remembering Aldrich's letter, taught him the Orc technique of chip carving, which used a curved blade to shape figures in low relief. By the time Tam was 12, his carvings were being sold at the Thornwood trade post, and merchants from Lowtown were paying silver for a Tam original fox or wolf. Scylla, meanwhile, had inherited her mother's sharp mind and her father's stubbornness. Grekka taught her to read and write, first in the human script, then in Orcish runes, and by age 8 she was reading trade contracts aloud at the border meetings Grekka hosted twice a year. The child who had once clutched a wooden fox in a crawl space became the unofficial scribe of the Thornwood neutral zone, her handwriting recognized by crown clerks and clan elders alike. The neutral zone itself grew. Grekka's trust had created a legal anomaly, a privately held parcel of contested land governed by an Orc warden with no official allegiance. Initially, both sides treated it as a temporary inconvenience. But over time, as skirmishes flared elsewhere along the border, the Thornwood cottage became the only place where crown and clan representatives could meet without violating each other's territory. Grekka enforced a strict code: no weapons inside the cottage, no dispute left unresolved at the table, and no child, human or Orc, ever threatened. She mediated 7 border disputes in the first 5 years. By the 8th year, she had brokered a permanent ceasefire between the Broken Ridge clan and the Crown's northern garrison, an agreement that held because neither side wanted to lose access to the neutral ground. The leaders who came to negotiate sometimes remarked on the 2 children who served tea and arranged chairs. Tam, tall and quiet, with his father's green eyes, would set a carved centerpiece on the table, a symbol of the meeting's purpose. Scylla, sharp and precise, would translate when the human and Orc dialects diverged. They were not merely wards. They were essential. But the real test came in the 10th year, when Tam was 16. A new governor had been elected in the province, a hardliner who campaigned on reclaiming lost crown holdings and restoring human supremacy along the border. He sent a company of 50 soldiers to enforce the long-expired demolition order, arguing that the trust was an illegal agreement made under duress and that the Crown's original claim predated the Blight. The troops marched to the Thornwood cottage with a battering ram and a writ of seizure. Grekka stood in the yard alone, her splitting maul. The same maul she had used against Voss a decade earlier held loosely at her side. She was older now, silver streaking her hair, but her shoulders were still broad and her gaze still level. Behind her, Tam and Scylla stood in the doorway, unarmed but unafraid. They had faced threats before. They knew the word badger was still the signal to retreat to the crawl space, but they had both decided, separately, that this time they would not hide. What happened next was not a battle. It was a political recalculation so swift that historians would later call it the Thornwood Miracle. Greca had spent 10 years building relationships. She sent a signal to the Broken Ridge, and within 6 hours, 100 orc warriors were positioned on the ridge overlooking the cottage, visible to the Crown Company. She sent a rider to the Crown's own trade commissioner, who had benefited enormously from the neutral zone's stability, and the commissioner dispatched an urgent protest to the governor, threatening to recall loans. And she released, for the first time, the full documentation of the rust spore blight, including the name of the magistrate who had ordered it and the Crown quartermaster who had supplied the canisters. The scandal broke in the provincial capital within 2 days. The governor, facing impeachment, withdrew the demolition order and replaced his border commander. The company of soldiers, left without orders, marched back to the garrison. Greca had not fired a single shot. The trust was never challenged again. Tam and Scylla watched their guardian do all of this, and they learned. Tam, who had been a scared boy clutching a wooden fox, grew into a man who understood that power was not always held by the largest army. He became a negotiator, traveling with Greca to border councils and trade summits, his carvings a symbol of the peaceful exchange the neutral zone represented. Scylla, who had once asked if Papa would wake up for breakfast, became a scholar of border law, eventually writing the first treaty that formally recognized neutral territories as a distinct legal category. Neither forgot the stories Greca told them at night, the stories of a dying carpenter who had hired an assassin to kill him, and the assassin who had dropped her knife because she saw 2 small faces in a blanket pile. The surprising detail, the thing that Greca kept hidden for nearly 2 decades, emerged only after Tam's 21st birthday. He had been going through his father's old papers, preparing to register the deed in his own name, when he found a second letter tucked inside the lining of the strongbox. It was addressed not to Greca, but to him. Aldrich had written it the same week he wrote Greca's letter, and he had hidden it so carefully that even Greca had never found it. The letter read, Tam, if you're reading this, you're a man now. I need you to know something I couldn't tell you when you were small. The day Greca dropped her blade, I didn't hire her to kill me. I hired her to protect you. I knew her reputation, that she never killed a child, that she had lost her own family. I gambled that if she saw you, she wouldn't be able to finish the contract. I set the whole thing up, the timing, the unlocked back window, you and Scylla in the blanket nest. I made sure she saw my children before she saw my throat. It was the cruelest gamble I ever made, and it worked. Forgive me for not telling you. Forgive me for using your fear as a weapon, but I was dying, and you were everything, and I had to believe that the monster who walked through the door would see what I saw. 2 small people worth saving. I was right. She saw you, and she stayed. The rest is yours to carry. Tam read the letter in silence, and then he brought it to Greca. She read it, and for the first time in 21 years, she wept. Not because she had been manipulated, she had long suspected the truth, but because Aldrich's final gamble was the bravest, most desperate act of fatherhood she had ever witnessed, and it had given her a second chance at a family she had never thought she deserved. That night, she burned the letter in the hearth, and she told Tam and Scylla the story from the beginning. This time, with no omissions. The truth, she said, was that Aldrich had been the one to save them all. And the most unlikely alliance ever forged on the Thornwood border had been built not on a blade, but on a father's last, wild, loving lie. The story of the Thornwood cottage is, at its core, a story about the space between what we hire and what we receive. Aldrich went to the Crooked Nail looking for an ending, and instead found a guardian. Greca arrived with a blade sharpened for a dying man, and instead found a reason to live. The children who huddled under blankets, clutching a carved fox, grew up to shape the border politics of an entire region. Not because anyone planned it, but because a handful of desperate choices collided in a moment that no strategy could predict. Historians debate whether the Thornwood neutral zone would have formed anyway, whether the Crown and the clans would have eventually found a way to de-escalate without the cottage as a bargaining table. But the people who were there, the traders, the clan elders, the garrison soldiers who later retired and told their grandchildren about the Orc Warden, don't debate it. They know that the stability of the border rested on the shoulders of a woman who had every reason to let the world burn and chose instead to plant creche tubers in blighted soil. It's easy to romanticize that choice. It's much harder to recognize it for what it was, a daily act of will repeated for decades by someone who had once been paid to kill. Greca died at 72, in the same cottage where she had once dropped her blade. Tam and Scylla were middle-aged by then, with children of their own, and the trust had been renewed under a new warden, Tam's eldest daughter, a half-orc named Marith, who had inherited her grandmother's steady hands and her mother's diplomatic instincts. The neutral zone survived the transition. It is still there today, a small patch of unclaimed ground in the Thornwood buffer, where Crown and clan representatives still meet under the terms Greca negotiated. The creche tubers are gone now. The soil has been clean for a generation. But the cottage still has a carved wooden fox on the mantel, and every child born there learns the story of the night an assassin spared a dying man, not because she was weak, but because she remembered what it meant to lose a child and refused to make another orphan. If this story stayed with you, make sure to subscribe to Orkthorn Chronicles. It's free, it takes a second, and every subscription helps us keep telling these tales. Drop a like. Tell us in the comments which moment hit hardest: the blade dropping, the letter in the strongbox, or the day the truce was forged. And if you want to hear more from the Thornwood border, the Broken Ridge, and the ghosts who guard the passes, hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Because sometimes the most dangerous people in the world aren't the ones who draw the blade. They're the ones who choose to set it down and stay.